Today, I'm going to have a conversation that for many, and maybe including myself, I would say is difficult, but I think it's an important discussion. During COVID-19, and anytime there is a crisis, things change, circumstances are not in our control, and we try to adapt to the new tomorrow. But there's also loss. So people are losing loved ones. And we cannot have this discussion and really experience what is happening unless we actually talk about loss and grief. And that's what I want to talk about, the difficult topic of loss. And I could not think of a better person to have this conversation with, and I somehow happened to find the perfect person for these topics, is Claire Bidwell Smith, the author of Anxiety, the Missing Stage of Grief. She's a nationally recognized grief expert, and she's written 3 books on grief and loss. Claire, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So let's dig in a little bit right away. Your latest book talks about anxiety as a missing stage of grief. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, I think the baseline is that there is no perfect formula for grief. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who coined the 5 stages of grief in the 1960s, was a renowned physician who was seeing a lot of these stages in her dying patients. So she was recognizing them in the phases that we go through when we are approaching death. The stages kind of later were applied to the stages of grieving or the process of grieving. And they don't encapsulate everything. Even Kubler-Ross herself said that. They were meant as guideposts. And so today, as the research continues to unfold, as we continue to explore grief, we see that it's not always a linear thing. It's not always formulaic. We can't just kind of move through it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And one of the things I've been seeing in my over a decade-long career in the grief world is anxiety coming on as a component after going through loss. And I wasn't seeing it recognized anywhere in the literature, anywhere in the clinical world, yet I was seeing client after client who was experiencing new symptoms of anxiety, or just kind of broader, bigger symptoms of anxiety than they had felt before after losing someone they loved.
So if I can go a little bit more in detail about that, what that looks like, I'll tell you what I think you mean. It could mean anxiety at a higher level, right? This typical traits of anxiety. Secondary, it could be that you've lost someone and now you feel like, who's next? The lack of permanency, like the betrayal of long-term companionship. Does that seem like it's along those lines?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's what you kind of touched on in your intro. It's this feeling that we're all in right now of uncertainty, of not feeling safe, right? And those are similar feelings that come on when we lose someone we love. It's suddenly this big reminder of our mortality. We remember that nothing is really certain, that we're not in control of anything. We don't know how long we have here with the people we love. And so when we are forced to kind of face that reality, it can be very unsettling and it can cause that anxiety. And the anxiety manifests in many ways. You know, we can have physical symptoms where we're having panic attacks or heart palpitations, excuse me, or, having a nauseous feelings or tingling. Those are kind of physical symptoms. But then we can also have other symptoms where we're experiencing hypochondria. We're worrying that we're going to get sick or other people we love might get sick and die. We're having social phobias, not wanting to engage in the same ways we always have wanted to. So this anxiety that comes on after a loss, it can increase. You could maybe already have had anxiety and now you're having more of it, or you can be having anxiety for the first time. And those are all the kind of symptoms that come from it.
So what's powerful to me about, the whole world of grief counseling is that you are identifying grief for people as a necessary process of the human experience. And I think that's a wake-up call too, right? It's a wake-up call for people. Like, I always describe it as everyone that you love or everyone that you've built a relationship, we intellectually know can leave and will leave. So how do we as humans incorporate that in our everyday life to maintain joy within that reality? Is that kind of how you would describe
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have to incorporate this. This is the one experience we are all going to go through no matter what. We will lose people we love. We ourselves will die. These things are inevitable. And I think that learning to sit with those truths and learning to incorporate them into our day-to-day life can actually make our lives more meaningful, can enrich us, can show us what's important to us, what matters, what we want to focus on. And I think, you know, to an extent, we're going through that with the pandemic. We need permission to grieve. We're all grieving right now, even if we're not losing someone directly, even if you don't know someone right now who has died because of the pandemic, you're still grieving probably. You're grieving, you know, the life you were living 3 months ago, or your children being home from school, or the loss of a job, or your company falling apart. There's so many different ways to grieve that are beyond just losing someone we love. And I think the more that we can give ourselves permission to do that, the more we can know ourselves on a better level, and the more that we can live meaningful lives.
So let's talk about this a little bit. You use this very interesting word for everyone listening. You use the word enrich. And I think that for people that have not been in conversation with a grief counselor and is kind of not in that world, they don't find that word enriching as common vocabulary when they've suffered loss. How can that loss enrich meaning make something better when you've actually lost something? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, I don't want to diminish how difficult it is to lose someone. I've been through my own personal losses. It's what brought me into this field. I lost both of my parents at a young age. I was an only child. It was so much. I went through many dark places, hard times. And when I began to come through it, that was where the enrichment came. And that's where it comes for most people. There's a kind of descent through all the pain and the grief that you must experience. And then when we begin to move forward, to rebuild, to understand what our lives look like now that this thing has changed, often we find new ways to be in the world that may be better than they were before. I think the same will be true of the pandemic. I think it's true when we lose someone we love. It's not an easy process, but we end up getting pared down to our essence in a way. You know, we really start to figure out what's important. Why are we here? Why do we want to be here? What matters to us? And when I look back at everything and anything hard that's ever happened to my life, it's made me a better person. It's made me more empathic. It's made me stronger, more resilient, more creative, able to love deeper, harder, you know, live more fully.
So this is really interesting. There's two things that stood out to me. One is the fact that when we go through this process and we recognize grief as a necessary step, we grow. And you're kind of the manifestation of that, Claire, because what you're describing as your past, you could have been, and you may have been, we'll get into that, you know, like this for the rest of your life. And you've actually now helped thousands of people come to the other side. And that is a manifestation of the enrichment you're talking about. So if you could give me permission to ask you, you talk about you lost your parents at a young age. Where do you feel that you pivoted, and where do you feel, if there was a moment in time, and I'm sure there's many, where you felt like there's another future for me than what these descriptive words would have for me, for my future?
It's a great question. And I really had to hit rock bottom before I could pivot. Both of my parents got cancer at the same time when I was 14. Again, I was an only child. My mom died when I was 18 and my father when I was 25. So I was in my mid 20s, living a really different experience than all of my peers. You know, they were out of college in their first apartments, you know, first beginnings of their careers, new relationships. And I was in the throes of grief and really unsure of what the point was in being here. You know, I drank too much, I traveled all the time, I got into terrible relationships, just trying to avoid all the grief and pain I was going through. There was always a part of me, though, that wanted to find a way out, I think. My parents have been wonderful people, and I think they had showed me enough of you know, how wonderful the world can be and how interesting it is, that there was part of me that really wanted to find my way out of it. I found my way out through therapy, through yoga, through meditation, through other people who helped me, and ultimately through service. You know, I began working in nonprofits, with homeless people, with underserved school kids, and those things that made my life feel meaningful again were vital. And that was what the pivot really came, and the shift came when I began to want to help other people get through anything, everything.
Specific to COVID-19 and everything that's happening now about people passing away alone. I think that's very specific. I think funerals are not what they were in the past. What conversations are you having with people, or thoughts that you have about people not being able to be with their loved ones at that time of passing?
Yeah, this is a very real and very big issue with COVID-19 right now. People are dying alone in hospitals. Their loved ones are not able to be there with them and say goodbye. People are grieving alone. We're having to forego regular customs, funerals, sitting Shiva, having wakes, memorials. These are very real things that are happening, and they're very difficult to move through. I think that a lot of those things do help us find some peace and start to move through our grief process when we're able to say goodbye, when we're able to memorialize and gather together and honor people. Taking those things away can stunt the grief process a little bit. I think that we are coming up with things that are better than nothing. You know, these virtual funerals, virtual wakes, saying goodbye over FaceTime, obviously not ideal at all, but they are better than nothing at all. So I think that we need to turn towards them for now. In this interim period, I think that we will come back to grieving and mourning in many ways. I think that there's always time and space and room for grief and mourning. And I think that we will do the best we can right now in these circumstances. And then when we are able to do more memorials, funerals, gatherings, I think we will do that again. There's always room for more mourning in that sense. I think we have to show up for each other, really support each other, reach out to people who are grieving right now, let them know you're thinking about them. If it's heartening to know, everyone that I know in the grief world, we have been coming together for weeks, meeting on Zoom every week, trying to create spaces, programs, support, online courses, and offerings for people who are going through grief. We've come together in a way that I've never seen before in the grief world, and it's really beautiful.
There are people who have lost individuals, and people want to be there for them. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are of how you distinguish between what you think you should do when someone has lost somebody, and how you decipher what the person actually needs, and how to give that space. And then secondly, there's people passing of all ages. So how do we have this conversation with people that are quite young? Right? How are they dealing with that loss?
Those are great questions. I think that when we are trying to support someone or show up for someone who's gone through a loss, the biggest thing we can do is get out of our own way. We have a lot of feelings that come up. It's so hard to watch someone in pain, in discomfort. So we often get in there and try to want to fix things and get busy and help them do something. The best thing we can do is step away from our own discomfort and just show up with curiosity. Let them know that you're there and ask them how you can help. As you know, going through the loss of your father, was there anything anyone could actually do for you other than show up and listen and be compassionate? There's very little, right? I think that if we show up and we have an agenda of what we think they need to be doing, or if they need to be moving on or sitting in it, or let's go clean out your closet, or whatever it is that we think we need to help them do, they get messages that either they're not doing something right, or they need to be moving on quicker, or they need to be feeling something they're just not feeling yet, or maybe ever. So the bottom line is showing up without an agenda and just showing up with curiosity and compassion and letting them know that you're here for them. Even if you don't know the answers to something, again, that's stepping out of our own zone of uncomfortability and just showing up and saying, I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do, but I want you to know I'm here. That's the best thing we can do.
Because it can play, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I was saying it can play both roles of when we get into our own mindset, because we can show up just because we feel like we need to show up, or we can not show up because, again, we're uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. And I think when you're sincere and you listen to your gut, it'll tell you, right?
Exactly.
What role to play.
It's okay to be scared. It's okay to not know the answers. All you need to do is show up. And I think that that's what's important. And it's similar to talking with younger people about grief and loss. I think a lot of adults become afraid of talking to young kids about grief and loss because they don't know what to say. They don't know how to answer some of these questions. They don't want to see a child in pain. But when we don't talk with kids about this stuff, it sends them the message that we're not supposed to talk about it. You're not supposed to feel it. So we have to, again, create that space. Just open up the conversation for them. And again, step out of your own way. We have to remember that kids can only take in developmentally as much as they can, so an 8-year-old going through a loss isn't going to think about that loss in the same way that we do. We think about their whole life ahead of them. Oh my gosh, they're going to have to go through college or get married or have a baby without their parent there or whoever it was they lost. They're not thinking about it that way. They're very much in the day-to-day. So we have to be careful not to superimpose our thoughts and feelings on top of them. And again, come back to that place of curiosity. How are you today? What do you need? What do you want to talk about? The one thing I love to tell parents that I think is really important is, again, this idea, it's okay not to have the answers. It's okay to say, I don't know. If a kid has a big question like, what happens when we die? It is okay for you to say, I don't know. What do you think happens? And just create that space for them to talk about it and explore.
Thank you so much for being so committed. And I'm so grateful for the work that you do for everyone.
Thank you so much. I'm so grateful for you to have this hard conversation and hold space for this topic that people really need to be able to hear about.
With that, I'm just inspired about the growth that comes from grief. And I'm inspired about what we can do to keep moving forward. So with that, again, as always, I bid you peace.